Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to learn about session-based authentication. Session-based authentication is a stateful authentication method that uses sessions on the server side and cookies, local storage, or session storage on the client side to keep track of the authenticated user. The user enters their credentials into the application's login form and submits to the server as a post-HTTP request with the form input credentials. The server verifies the user's credentials, usually by checking on a database. If the credentials are valid, the server creates a user session. Inside the session contains data about the user like ID, username, and email, for example. And it also contains a unique session ID. This session data can be stored in memory or in a database. The server then returns this unique session ID to the browser as a response, and the browser will store the session ID, usually on the cookies, but can also store on the local storage or session storage. From now on, every time this user requests a page, the browser will include the session ID in every request sent to the server. If the session ID is valid, the server checks the user stored on the session by the session ID and responds with the requested resource. Once the user logs out, the session is destroyed on the server and the session ID deleted from the browser. Let's see in practice how session-based authentication works by building an application with Node.js and Express. I'll be using VS Code for the tutorial, but feel free to use any other code editor you like. I have an empty folder open on VS Code called session-based auth Node.js, and let's start by creating our Node project. So I'll open the terminal here on the top and type npm init, and I'll add a -y flag to populate all the options automatically with the default npm init values. Okay, project created, and we have a new package JSON file containing all details of our application, and we can change these details whenever we need. Let's install the dependencies we'll be using. So back on the terminal, let me clear and type npm install. And we're going to use Express to organize our routes like the login, logout route, and the home route that the user must be authenticated to access. And to create and store the session data used for authentication, we're going to use Express-session that can properly maintain the stateful interaction between Express dependency. And lastly, let's install a template engine to allow the rendering of dynamic content on our web pages. So let's use EJS. Okay, hit enter. Great, dependencies installed, and we can check here on the package JSON file under the dependencies object. Still inside the package JSON file, we have a main property which is pointing to an index.js file. So we need to create this file on the root of our project, and it's going to be the main file of our application. So let's create this file here on the root. So new file, index.js. And inside this file, I'm just gonna paste some lines of code here because in every video on the channel, I just keep repeating myself on creating a basic Express server. So here on the top, we are importing the Express module and then initializing Express inside a constant call app. Next, we are setting inside Express the EJS view engine. Next, we are creating a basic route like a home route that is rendering a template called home. So we need to create this home EJS file, we'll create soon. Next, we're telling Express to listen on port 3000, and if everything works, we should see the message server started on port 3000 on the console. So before running the index.js file to test all this, let's create this home EJS file that we are rendering inside our home route. By default, Express expects for the template files to be inside a folder called views. We could of course configure a different folder, but let's use the default. So here on the root, I'll create a new folder called views, and inside I'll create a new file called home.ejs, which is the file we are rendering here inside the home route. And inside this file, EJS works just like a normal HTML file. So if you're using VS Code, you can type HTML and select the HTML column 5 option here, that it will create a basic HTML structure for us. So let me start by changing the title here to home, And inside the body tag, I'll just add a h1 element with a basic text inside like hello user, for example. Later we'll show the actual name of the logged user here instead. We're not going to use any styles or any CSS files here. Let's keep everything simple because the main focus here is authenticating users using sessions. Okay, let's run our main file, which is the index.js file. So let me open the terminal and type node index.js or just index and hit enter. Okay, we got server started on port 3000. That means our server is running. Now let's run the home route here. So let me open the browser and type localhost and port 3000. And here it is, the home EJS template with the h1 element. Okay, so everything's running. So the idea now is to only allow logged users to visit the home page. So if the user is not logged and try to visit the home route here, they should be redirected to a login page. So back on the code, let's create a login EJS file here inside the views folder. So new file, and we'll call this login.ejs. And inside this file, let's create a basic HTML structure just like before. And I'll change the title here to login. And inside the body tag, we're going to create two fields, which is the username and password inside a form so we can send to the backend. So I'll add a form element, and for the action attribute, I'll add a /login, and let's add a method attribute, which is equals to post. So we'll need to create a login post route inside our index.js file. And inside this form, I'll add an input element, and the type attribute we can leave as text, and I'll add a name attribute, which is equals to username. And let me add a label element above this input, and the for attribute here, I'll add username. So we'll need to add an ID here for the username input, and I'll call username as well. The same name we added here on the for attribute on the label. So when the user clicks on the label, it will focus on the username input. And the content inside the label, I'll add username. Great, now let me copy this label and input here and paste. So this will be for the password. And the content is password as well. Now for the input, the ID is password. And the type, we can change it to password. So this way it will mask all the characters. And the name is also password. Now below here, I'll add a button element. And I'll add a type attribute equals to submit to send the username and password data to the login post route here. And the content of the button, I'll add login. Okay, that's it for now for the login EJS file. Now here on the index.js, we need to create two routes. One to show the login page and another for the login post route that we added on the form action. So below the home route here, let's create the route to show the login page. So I'll call app dot, and this will be a get route. And the name we can add /login. The request and response parameters, arrow function, and inside we can call the response parameter dot render, and inside the login EJS file we created. Okay, now let's create the login post route to receive the username and password details from the form. So app dot, and this is a post route, and the name is also /login. Just like we added on the form action, the request and response parameters, arrow function. And inside, let's just write on the console the details that the form is sending. So console.log, and to get the body request data, we can call the request parameter .body. Now, for the data to appear on the request body, we need to configure Express to accept form data from the client. So below the view engine configuration, I'll call app.use property, and inside I'll call the express module .url encoded function. which will parse incoming requests with the URL encode payloads. And inside we can add an object here to configure some options, but we'll only set the extended option here, which is a Boolean type, and by default this is set to true. That means it will parse the URL encoded data using a library called QS. And if set to false, it will parse using a library called queryString. So I'll set this to false to use the queryString library. You can read more about the express URL encoded configuration by visiting the website that is showing on the video. Great, now let's test all this to make sure everything's working. So here on the terminal, let me stop the server by pressing Ctrl+C and type again node index command. Okay, server started. Now here on the browser, let me open the login page. So after the localhost 3000 here, I'll add /login. And perfect, here's the login page with the username and password fields and the button. So for the user, I'll add John, for example, and for the password, I'll add 123. And click on the login button. Since we didn't send any response back to the client, it will just keep loading here till it times out. Now back on the code. As you can see, we received the user as John and the password as 123. So everything's working and we can start the session authentication. So inside the post login route, let me remove this console log from here. And since we're not using a database here, let's simulate that we are expecting some valid credentials here, and we're gonna search in our database for these user credentials to make sure they match, just so we can see how sessions works. So I'll add an if statement here, checking if the request parameter .body.username is equals to John, for example, all in lowercase, and the request.body.password is equals to 123. Of course, in a real application, we're definitely going to search for these credentials inside a database or some other storage method. This is just for testing. So if the username is John and the password is 123, then I'll add a comment here, create session and store user logged details. So we'll get back here soon and I'll add an else statement here. So if the user is not John or the password is not 123, then let's send an error to the client. So what we can do here is show the login page again, but with an error message. So we can call the response parameter .render, and we're going to render the login.ejs file, and we can send a second parameter here, which is an object with any details we want to send to the client. So we can send an error property saying something like wrong credentials. Now to show this error on the login page, let me open the login.ejs file and let's show the error below the form element here. So first we need to check if there is an error property, and for that we can use the EJS syntax, which is less than symbol, percentage, and the closing tag for this is the percentage symbol and the greater than symbol. And inside the syntax we can add JavaScript code, so I'll add an if statement and check if there is an error property and open curly brace, and below here I'll add again the EJS syntax, and inside I'll add the closing curly brace. Now inside the if statement here we can add normal HTML code, so I'll add a paragraph element, and inside this paragraph let's show the error, so I'll add another EJS syntax here. But to show data sent from the backend, we need to add an equal symbol, and we can add the error property here. So if you're not familiar with the EJS syntax, this might seem a little confusing, but once you start working more with EJS, you'll get used to it. Okay, let's test all this and run the node index command again on the terminal. And if we try to access the login route again, you can see we got an error here, saying error is not defined. That's because here on the get login route, we also need to send the error property here. So let me add an object here with the error, but equals to null. So let me run again the node index on the terminal. And let's try to access the login route again. And perfect. Let's test by inserting a wrong credentials here. So for the username, I'll add John. But for the password, I'll add 1234. And click on login. And there it is, the wrong credentials error. Now let's try inserting a wrong username. So I'll add test, for example. And 123 for the password. Click on login. And the same error. Now let's add the correct credentials here. So John for the username and 123 for the password. And click on the login button. And of course nothing happens because we're not sending any response or rendering any templates to the client. So let's use sessions here inside the if statement if the credentials are correct. So let's start by importing here on the top, below express, the express session dependency. So I'll add const session equals to require and inside express dash session. Now we need to configure the session inside express. So below the URL encoded here, I'll call app.use and inside I'll call the session we just imported. And inside here we can configure some options inside an object. So inside the object, let's add the secret property, which is required, and it's like a password that only our backend knows. And this is to hash the session details, so make sure to store this securely. For our example, I'll just add directly here, something like my_session_secret. And we need to also set a property called resave. The default value is true, but using the default has been deprecated, so we must set this property. So if we're using a session store driver and this session store driver doesn't support implementing the touch command, then we should set this to true. So even when a session wasn't changed during the request, it is still updated in the store. I'll just set this to true, which is the default, but we still need to set explicitly here. Next, we can set the save uninitialized property. So the session is basically an object that is passed on the request. When an empty session object is created and no properties are set, that means it's on the uninitialized state. So setting this property to false, you will not save the session if it's not modified. So let's set this to false. And let's leave with these properties for now, but later we'll add more properties here. Now back on the login post route. So if the credentials are correct, let's save the user details inside the session. And in Express, we need to set the session inside the request parameter, so we can have access to the session in all requests. So I'll call the request parameter dot session, and we can add any properties here inside the session. And in this case, let's add dot user property. And this is equals to an object. So let's say we have the John user inside a database with more details. For example, an ID, and on the database, John's ID is 1. And we can also store the username, and in our case, we can add John here. In most of the applications out there, usually the username is the email of the user. But to make it simple, we just added John. And let's say on the database, we also have the name of the user. So let's add here the full name, which I'll add John Doe, for example. And make sure to never store any sensitive information of the user inside the session, like passwords, for example. Okay, so we need to send a response to the client. In this case, since the credentials are good and the user details are stored on the session, then we can redirect the user to the home route up here. So I'll call the response parameter dot redirect, and inside we can add the home route, which is just /. So let's test all this. Back on the terminal, let's stop the server and run again node index command. Okay, now back on the browser, let's call the login route again. And I'll add John for the username and 123 for the password. And before clicking on login, let me open the developer tools here. And for this session, we saved it on the request, by default is store an identifier of that session on the cookies. So to access the cookies on the browser, I'll select the application tab here. And under storage here on the left, let's expand the cookies here and click on the localhost port 3000. And as you can see, there aren't any cookies here yet. So when we click on the login button, in addition to redirect the user to the home route, it will also create a cookie with an identifier of the session. So let's click. Great, we are redirected to the home page. And as you can see, it created a cookie here called connected.sid. And the value is hashed because of the secret property we configured. This is like an ID to identify the session on the server. And we can change this name here if we want. So let me delete this cookie here by clicking on the X here. So back on VS Code, here on the session configuration on the top, we can add the name property. So for example, I'll add manfra.io, and of course you can add any name you like. And let's run this again on the terminal. So every time we stop and start the server, the session will be removed. That's because it's stored on memory as long as the server is running. Later on the video, we'll see that it's possible to store the session in different places like a database, Redis, files, and others. And then even if the server is down, the session details will remain stored. So let's stop and run node index command again. Okay, now let's open the login route again and enter the credentials. Click on login. And here it is, the cookie with the name manfra.io. Great. Now we need to take care of some things here. So even if the user is logged, we can still access the login route here. We need to avoid that and redirect the user to the home route instead. And let me delete the cookie here again. Now if we stop the server and run node index again, and let's access the login route, note that there isn't a cookie here, but we can still access the home route. So we need to protect the home route by redirecting the user to the login route. So back on the code, we need to create something called middleware inside the get home route here. And a middleware is basically a function that will be executed before executing the route. We can add as many middlewares we want before accessing the final destination. So let's create our middleware functions inside another file just so we can keep separated from the index.js file. So here on the root, I'll add a new file and we'll call this middlewares.js. And we'll create two functions here. The first function will check if the user is logged so it can access the protected route. Otherwise, we'll redirect the user to the login route. And we need to export these functions so we can use in other files. To do so, I'll add exports dot and the name of the function, so we can call this check logged in, for example. And we have access here to the request and response parameters. And we can also add the next parameter here. And the next parameter we need to call when we can access the next middleware function. And if there isn't another middleware function, it will access the route. And let's add a arrow function. So inside here, we need to check if there is a user object in the session. That means the user is logged. So I'll add an if statement here. And we can call the request parameter dot session dot user. So if it exists, that means we have a logged user. So inside the if statement, we can call the next parameter method to access the next middleware or the protected route. And I'll add an else statement here. So if there isn't a user object on the session, that means we don't have a logged user. So we can redirect the user to the login route. So I'll call the response parameter dot redirect and inside the slash login route. Great, now back on the index.js file, we need to import the check logged in middleware function we just created. So here on the top, below the express session import, I'll add a const and an object equals to require. Since the middlewares.js file is on the root, we can add dot slash and add the middlewares file. And inside the object here, we're going to extract the check logged in function from inside the middleware's file. Now, to add this middleware function to the get home route, we simply need to add before the request and response parameters and after the name. So I'll call check logged in middleware function. So when we're calling the next parameter, it will access the route content here. And if we want to add another middleware function here, let's say we created another function to check the permissions of the user, for example, we can add a comma here and insert the other function. Simple as that. Now let's test all this. So back on the terminal, let me stop and run again node index command. Okay, now back on the browser, let me close the developer tools here. And now if we try to access the home route, we are redirected to the login route. Perfect. And let's log in with our user here. And click on login. Perfect. But we can still access the login page. So we need to create another middleware function and add inside the get login route. So back on the middlewares.js file, let's create another function that will check if the user is not logged. Then it can access the login page. Otherwise, if the user is logged, we'll redirect the user to the home route. So we're gonna basically bypass the login. So I'll call here export dot, and we can call this bypass login, for example. And we also have access to the request, response, and the next parameters. Arrow function, and inside I'll add an if statement here and check if the user object is not on the session. So that means the user is not logged. So I'll add an exclamation sign here and call the request parameter dot session dot user. And in this case, we can call the next parameter, which will access the login route. And else, if the user is logged and tries to access the login page, we can redirect the user to the home route. So I'll call the response parameter dot redirect, and I'll add just slash here. Great. Now on the index.js file, here on the top, let's extract the bypass login function from the middleware's file. And here on the get login route, let's add the bypass login function. Okay, now let's test again, back on the terminal. Let me stop and run node index command. Okay, back on the browser, let's access the home route. Okay, we are redirected to the login route, which we already tested. So let me enter the credentials and click on login. Okay, so we're logged. And if we try to access the login route, perfect, we are redirected to the home route. So now we are protecting the home route and avoiding the logged user to access the login route. Now we need to add a logout functionality. So when the user logs out, we need to destroy the session on the server, delete the cookie on the browser, and redirect the user to the login route. So here on the home EJS file, below the h1 element, let's add a link element, and the href attribute, let's point to a route called /logout. So we need to create this route on the index.js file as well. And the content, we can add logout. Okay, now let's create the logout route on the index.js file. So below the post login route, I'll call app dot, and this is a get route. And the name we added as /logout. The request and response parameters, arrow function. And inside, the first thing we need to do is destroy the session. So I'll call the request parameter dot session dot destroy method. This will remove the session object from the request. And let's redirect the user back to the login route. So I'll call the response parameter dot redirect. And here actually let's redirect the user to the home route. So then it will fall on the check logged in middleware function. And since we destroyed the session, so it should fall inside the else statement here, redirecting the user to the login route. That way we are testing if the session is destroyed. So I'll redirect here to the home route by adding a slash. Great, let's test all this. So back on the terminal, let me stop and run node index command. Now let's test on the browser. So I'll open the home route. Okay, we are redirected to the login route. So let me enter the credentials. Click on login. Okay, here's the home page with the logout link. So now when we click, perfect, we got redirected to the login route. So that means the session was destroyed. But if we open the developer tools, note that the cookie is still there. So we need to delete the cookie from the browser as well. So back on the index.js file, on the logout route, below the session destroy method, to delete the cookie, we need to send this command on the response parameter. So response dot, and we can call the clear cookie method, and as a parameter, it expects the name of the cookie. In this case, we're configured as manfra.io here. Okay, let's test again on the terminal. So stop and run node index command. Back on the browser, let's refresh and enter the credentials. Okay, now click on logout and perfect, the cookie is removed. Awesome, so we completed the logout functionality, destroying the session on the back end and removing the cookie on the front end. Great, so till now we added the login and logout functionality and learned how to use middlewares to protect routes and redirect the user to the correct route. But what if we want to send the user details, save it on the session, to the browser? Of course, we could add a second parameter here on the render method and send the details from the session, but imagine if we had multiple routes and we want to send the user details in almost all of them. It might lead to an exhausting task. Especially if we modified something on the session, then we would need to modify in all routes. It makes no sense. So instead, Express offers a way to configure in only one place. That way, it will send the data we want to all routes inside the response parameter. So this place is called the locals, and it's a property inside the response parameter. The response locals property is an object that holds response local variables specific to the current request. It has a scope limit to the request and is accessible only to the views rendered during the particular request response cycle. So let's configure the response locals inside Express, and I'll add below the session configuration here. So I'll call app.use, and inside I'll add the request, response, and the next parameters, so we can have access to all parameters. An arrow function, and inside I'll call the response parameter dot locals, and just like the session on the request parameter, we can add properties inside the locals object. So I'll add a user property by adding dot user, and inside this user property we can add what's stored inside this session user property. So I'll call the request parameter dot session dot user, and below here we need to call the next parameter to access the middleware functions or the route itself. Perfect. So now inside the home EJS file, since we have access to the logged user details, we can add here on the H1 element, for example, the name of the user stored on the locals. So instead of showing hello user, we can show hello and the name of the logged user. So I'll remove the user tags from here, and I'll add the EJS syntax, which is less than %, and the closing tag, which is the opposite, % greater than. And here on the open tag, I'll add an equal sign, and we can show the properties we added inside the locals. So we can call the user object dot name. Great, let's make sure this is working. So back on the terminal, let me stop and run node index. Back on the browser, let me refresh and enter the credentials. Perfect, it's showing hello John Doe. So we can add any details here on the response locals. For example, let's say we are building an online store and we want to show the products a user has on the shopping cart. So we need to store the shopping cart on the session, store it on the response locals to send to the client, and show the details inside our views. Awesome. Just one last detail I'd like to show here before we wrap up. Inside the session configuration, we could specify a time for the cookie to live on the browser. So let's say if the user is logged and we want to keep that user logged for a day, for example. And then when the user tries to access any route, if that time is expired, the user will be redirected to the login page because the cookie on the browser no longer exists. So the server can't identify the session. So here inside the session object, we can add the cookie property, which is an object. And inside we can configure some cookie properties for the browser. In our case, we want to set the max age property, and this expects a number in milliseconds, and it's the time that the cookie will exist on the browser. Just for testing, I'll add just 10 seconds, so in millisecond, this is 10,000. Let's make sure it's working, so back on the terminal, let me stop the server and run again Node index. Okay, back on the browser, let me log out and enter the credentials. Okay, and after 10 seconds, the cookie will be deleted and the user will be redirected to the login route. So let me refresh here. Okay, not yet. Let me refresh again. And perfect, the cookie was removed and the user is not logged anymore. Awesome. So we learned in this video how to add authentication using sessions on the server combining with cookies on the browser. We implemented a login and logout routes. We learned how to protect routes, how to send data stored on the session to the client inside the response locals. We learned some configurations for the express session dependency, for example, how to set an expiration for the cookie. And if you want to learn more about the express session dependency, you can visit expressjs.com/en for English /resources/middleware/session. Here you can find all properties we can set. And if you scroll down to the bottom here, you can find other dependencies that can be used in combination with the express session. So instead of storing the session in memory, we could store it in a database like MongoDB using this connect mongo dependency, or Postgres using the connect pg simple, or for example Redis using the connect Redis, or in an external file like loadb here or locky.js. So you can find the specific dependency here depending where you want to store the session. We also have a video here on the channel about API authentication using JWT. I'll leave the link on the description below, and I'll also leave the GitHub repo link for this complete example on the description as well. Hope this video was helpful to you, and if it was, please click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching and hope to see you on the next video.